welcome back to Living Ad Maiorum with your hosts Gretchen Crowder and JP Mancini. Today on episode 2, we are interviewing Jim Linhares, Assistant Principal for Mission at St. Louis University High. I have known Jim for what feels like my entire time in Jesuit education, as we are both in the Central and Southern Jesuit province. He has a great passion for this work, particularly for mission and Ignatian spirituality. He also has a great love for music, which I hope comes up in this episode. JP, I know you and Jim have not yet met, but I think you're really going to like getting to know him in this interview. But first, here's a little more about Jim. He serves as an assistant principal for faculty and staff at St. Louis University High School. The first of 7 children, he grew up in one of the early parishes founded by the Jesuits, Sacred Heart in Florissant. He attended Sacred Heart Grade School and St. Louis Prep Seminary North High School, spent 2 years at Cardinal Glennon College Diocesan Seminary, received undergraduate degrees in theology and English literature from St. Louis University, and earned an MA in religion and religious education from Fordham. He has been married for 41 years to his wife, Mary, and they have 3 boys, all of whom graduated from St. Louis U High. Andrew in 2004, David in 2008, and Will in 2010. He has served St. Louis U High for 42 years, 15 as an administrator. During his tenure, he has worn every hat possible, teaching theology, English, serving as a department chair, a coach of cross country, track, and tennis. He is even a member of the Missouri Track and Field Cross Country Hall of Fame. Beyond all that, he has a passion for field biology, having led St. Louis U High's 7th grade walkabout program and teaching field biology. Hiking and nature study remain his favorite hobbies. In his current position, he has administered programs for the recruitment, support, and spiritual formation for St. Louis U High faculty and staff. He is a frequent public speaker and adult educator on a wide variety of topics related to adult and adolescent spiritual formation. I cannot believe all of the things this man has done in his years in Jesuit education.
Jim sounds like your typical person who's been involved in Ignatian education and that they fill every single role possible in schools, but also just like the interests, right? That idea of someone who's kind of like a Renaissance man that has interests in every walk of life is such a Jesuit thing to hear about. And I know we hear a little bit more about him in his interview where he talks about coaching and music and his own work that he does at school. But it's just impressive to see someone who's worked, first of all, in the field for so many years. But I think what makes it so impressive is just he's able to have an impact in so many different areas of life. And I think that's what people will enjoy most about this conversation with Jim.
Yeah. So let's get started with our conversation with Jim Linhares. To the podcast. We're so excited to have you with us today. I know that you and I have encountered each other a lot in the Central and Southern province, but I think JP is new to you. So JP's, I think, really excited to get to know you.
It's even better, Jim. This way, if I don't know you and something goes wrong, I can pin it all on Gretchen and say that the interview went off the rails. I take absolutely no responsibility for anything that happens at that point.
Yeah, great. That's an easy out for you. Good deal.
I'm always looking for an easy out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I just, thank you guys for this super cool new initiative and new piece of communication that you've opened up for us across the country. Really grateful to you and excited for you. Way to go.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Jim, I just wanted you to talk to us a little bit about your personal background. If you got connected to the Jesuits at a young age, obviously you have lots of experience at this point, but how did that come to be, maybe even before professional life? Was there anything prior to that had you connected to the Jesuits?
Yeah, well, this is a cool thing for me to think about because, as is the case, I think, for all the things that deeply influence us, they're influencing you before you've got the names and are even aware of what they are, right? 3 or 4 miles from my house was the Jesuit novitiate in Florissant, Missouri. Very big deal if you're from the Midwest, the Jesuits at Florissant. That's where they all came as young men to study and prepare. I didn't know that as a kid. I would encounter them not knowing who they were because Sacred Heart Parish in Florissant was founded by the Jesuits in 1865. AMDG was on the cornerstone of the church I grew up in. And when I was a janitor there in eighth grade, I saw old dusty pictures, panorama of the entire parish with the old Jesuit priests that led the parish. And I said, oh, these were the old Jesuits, you know? So I was in a Jesuit parish, no longer staffed by Jesuits. It was diocesan men, but from the time I was a little kid. And when I was in high school, the associate at the parish gave a talk, an adult ed talk, which he entitled The Halcyon Days of the Jesuits, in which he talked about the Jesuit origins of the parish, and he talked about AMDG, and he went through each letter and talked about what that was. And it was so striking to me as a young guy that that year, 1977, I started keeping a journal, which I've kept ever since. And for many, many years, AMDG was the way I signed off in the journal because I'd finally been exposed to this Jesuit motto. You know, beyond that, I realize now looking back on it that I was exposed to the Jesuits by the Second Vatican Council, even though as a kid I didn't know what that was. But from about 1965 on, the kind of approach to religion that I was getting at my parish was inflected by the Second Vatican Council, especially in the early 70s. So I'd been a devotional little boy. I'd been a person who had devotional prayers that I prayed that nuns taught me. I loved O Sacred Head Surrounded and Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, and kind of the pre-Vatican II approach to sacred prayer and language. But I was also kind of a thinker, and I had questions, and I wondered how you could ever do anything in one lifetime to earn an eternity of punishment. That's the kind of kid that I was. So I really needed people to come along in those early 70s with Second Vatican Council theology to help me start thinking about my faith and not being discouraged about how it didn't ultimately make sense to me. So there are all kinds of people, from parish priests to high school teachers, who were there for me with what I now realize was Jesuit guided theology. I met Karl Rahner long before I read any of his books because he had been an influence on men and women that taught me. I recognize all of that now, and it's kind of cool to think back on it. So I didn't encounter the Jesuits as actual human beings in front of me until I went to college at St. Louis University, where I met people like John Kavanaugh, S.J., who was very much then into the critique of consumer culture and how we needed to be aware of what ads were saying to us so that we weren't sort of brought into a really cynical kind of materialist culture and didn't recognize how, you know, inimical to faith that was. Well, this guy was a dynamo. I mean, he just blew me away. So I was finally meeting Jesuits, actual Jesuits in college, and was very receptive to how they approached faith and belief, because I think from the early 70s on, I'd been being exposed to them. You know, Karl Rahner is a hero of mine now. I started reading him in college. He's like a real friend to me. He's like a person to me. I met his translator of his great works, a guy named Bill Dyke, S.J., who taught at Fordham. I went to St. Louis University. I went to Fordham University for undergrad and graduate. So by then, I'd met a lot of Jesuits. By then, I'd been on an 8-day silent retreat. They didn't tell me what I was doing. They didn't tell me it was the exercises. They just said, you're going on an 8-day silent retreat. So that's a little bit about some of the early parts of my exposure to the Jesuits, which was really much deeper than I realized even when I was going through it.
Yeah, so two parts to that, Jim. First of all, like, make a long story short, yes, basically, you were exposed to them without even knowing it from a young age. Yeah. And then secondly, you mentioned you're a thinker, so you're probably on the wrong podcast. That's the second part. You've come to the wrong place. We probably need to find a separate podcast for this. We're just making this up as we go. So this is the problem.
Yeah, Jim, I was struck by the AMDG because we have a parish right next to us at Jesuit Dallas called St. Rita that was also a Jesuit parish. And so the tower, the bell tower, has AMDG on it. And so I was a parishioner at St. Rita before I worked at Jesuit. I'm sure I did not know what AMDG was. because there weren't Jesuits in the parish at that time. But I resonated with that part of your
Well,
story.
I
I
guess
think,
that's why they put those things on those buildings so that eventually, we can
yes,
act,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So you were at St. Louis University. So maybe this is an obvious question, but what led you to St. Louis University High? And then what keeps you there?
Yeah, so I did get that deep exposure to the Jesuits when I was at St. Louis University. Some of those men became friends of mine, and of course, colleagues that were studying with me. And then I got the opportunity to study at Fordham, where I met more of them and sort of led more deeply into Jesuits and things Ignatian. But again, without a lot of the vocabulary yet. That didn't happen until the 90s, where the Jesuits really got more explicit about trying to hand a lot of this stuff off. By the time I graduated from Fordham and was looking for my first job, uh, I was a little bit tuned into the network. So a woman who went to college church, St. Francis Xavier College Church, where my then fiance, soon to be wife, went to church because it was the Jesuit parish, right? Uh, she said, "Hey, they've got an opening at St. Louis U High, and why don't you apply?" And I applied and got the job. I had wanted to go to St. Louis U High when I was a kid. My dad didn't let me go because he was a big fan of the other Catholic boys' high school, and he'd gone there. And so I ended up going to the diocesan high school seminary. But I had this little thing in my mind that SLU was kind of distinctive and a place that might suit me. So I was delighted to get the invite to apply and to win the job. That was in 1984.
You've been there quite a few years, right? So
Yeah,
what kept you there all this time? Obviously, you loved being a part of the Society of Jesus, being part of the Jesuits, and you never looked back after you went in, right?
yeah. Well, it's 42 years, and that is a
Mhm.
long time to be in one place. And what kept me there? Well, the students were tremendous to work with. I mean, really challenging, really interesting. I could walk in, and since I was kind of more of the thinker type and gravitated to the senior theology course, I could kind of go in there with my A game and really get after it. And
Mhm.
these guys were with me, or at least the challenge appealed to them, you know? So there's that for sure. Great students, fascinating people, a lot of, you could call it dialogue, you could call it argument, you could call it whatever you'd like, but, a lot of give and take with interesting, smart adolescents who were sort of up for what I was, going after, which was sort of depth and authenticity and really getting after it in terms of how we're thinking. But I also was a coach. I was, for many, many years, I was a cross country and track and field coach. And it just was a huge part of my life. I was able to build a team and a culture and eventually get to pretty successful kinds of athletic accomplishments. But aside from the success, just the closeness of working with young people day in and day out who are aspiring to get something from themselves that really is quite hard to get out of yourself. Distance running is super intense
Yeah.
psychologically and physically.
It's
Uh,
funny you mentioned that, Jim. We talked about, I did a retreat with some coaches and talked about it with other members of the network last week. And that's such a common story for people who have worked in Jesuit high schools. And I love it, right? Because I think it so beautifully paints the picture of the educational philosophy of the Jesuits, of the body, the mind and the soul. But that draw to athletics that keeps so many people pulled in. And in many cases, it's their introduction to Jesuit philosophy, is how their teams are run and what their experiences are like with coaches and players. I relate to that so much, but just that whole concept of athletics and Jesuit schools being the window that opens up for people to be drawn into Ignatian spirituality, such a beautiful thing, right? That pastoral aspect of athletics, I think, is such a common theme within all our schools and across the network.
it's so potentially fruitful. I still think we're
Mhm.
just kind of beginning to realize how fruitful it is and how rewarding it'll be if we can be a little more intentional. You don't want to be heavy-handed about sort of inserting something religious and spiritual into every moment, but I think we could do a lot more than we are doing. And I certainly found in my years of coaching that when I went there to get guys attentive to their inner life as athletes, And when I found a way to graft that to either leadership or service or prayer or an authentic approach to, the mystery God is inviting us into, whatever the language might have been, and I had coded language for it that I eventually found that worked well for young people, man, was it powerful. And it was confirmed by guys, years later who would say, uh, what was happening in our huddles before we raced 5,000 meters has stayed with me for my whole life. A kid that I coached who went on to be an artist and work at the Met in New York, he did a painting of our cross country huddle in which you can't even see me because I'm buried in the center of these guys. And he calls this painting, and it's a gorgeous piece. He calls it The Sermon. And it was his way of saying what was happening to me in those years of running and praying and bringing my interior life and communal spiritual journey. That was it. That set my life on a course. And so you hear things like that, and it's pretty cool, pretty gratifying.
I would say, Jim, also like not just understanding the student perspective as an athlete, as a coach and as a teacher, you understand those two different aspects of a student, but also you understand your faculty and staff better, who are coaches, who are teachers, who are coaches and teachers who work in different areas of the school. How has that being a coach and being a teacher helped you with the formation of your fellow colleagues?
No, that's great, and you're absolutely right. I will tell you that I had been a theology teacher for a long time before I got the assistant principal for mission, which has now been renamed assistant principal for faculty and staff because we brought two more people on to do adult formation. So this is one of the first years I'm not really doing a lot of adult formation because we brought two new people on, which I think was great for the school. But it wasn't until I had adults in front of me and was actually working with them that I really came to a deep conviction about how effective Ignatian spirituality was, because I could see how inviting them in a hospitable way into thinking about how God was journeying with them, by having them be open to their experience, not necessarily straightforwardly just a prayer and faith, but to their experience and how that might be where God was working with them, to open that space for them, invite them into it, and then see what happened and have them get to places, not because of what I was saying, but just because of the space you open up for them. It really was confirming that there was something here in a new way than it was working with students. When I saw what accompanying adults and helping them to connect God and their experience, even in the darkness, even in the desolation. I did these exercises for years called Thorns and Roses, where I would simply have them review the quarter, the month, the week, the day, and think about thorns and roses and welcome God into that space. And then remarkable stuff happened. The stories they would tell, what they would share with one another, how their lives would sort of begin to move in a different way. It was really confirming, exactly as you say, Gretchen.
Nothing like creating that space. It's funny that you mentioned that terminology of creating the space for the discussion and for the growth. That came up even in our conversation last time, Gretchen, right? That one of the biggest challenges, I think, for Jesuit institutions at this point is to create the space for genuine growth. And as you mentioned before, when you were talking about coaching, you can't just create a moment for prayer and spirituality in everything that you do, because it's no longer genuine at that point. When you're forcing it in to every opportunity, it feels like it's being jammed down their throats, as opposed to an opportunity for them to take on something that they actually feel is improving their life. So I love that image of creating the space for people within our building. And as you mentioned, when you can do that with the adults and they begin to feel that a space has been created for them, they're willing to do that with their own students and whoever else is in the community, obviously. And that's where some of that growth happens in its truest forms, I think.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, JP. And here's a problem. We'll call it a challenge, right? I had my athletes every day, so I could plug in to sort of the spiritual and soulful dimension of what I was doing, because I had them every day. I had them 6 days a week. Getting space for adults is hard for about 3 or 4 different reasons. One is you're cranking away at school, and every minute is precious, and every day is precious, and everybody's bargaining for time. So carving out space for formation is really just hard given a calendar. But second, these adults are busy, and
Mhm.
while they want to take advantage of the space, it's really hard to get them to commit to doing it. I've found over the years of doing this job that very infrequently do I get adults volunteering to come into those spaces,
Mhm.
even though they might know that what I'm going to offer is going to be great. I can
Yeah.
get them when I require them as a part of a pre-tenure program. I can get them when I require them as a part of our twice a year faculty staff retreats. But that's very little space. That's not much. You guys
Yeah.
all know that where you really get the fruits is by a good amount of space and time for formation. Well, that's one of the great challenges. How do we get that for adults?
I also wonder, Jim, because you said in your early years and even at SLU and at Fordham that you had exposure to Jesuits who had been in that lifelong formation, that had that time to be formed in the exercises, to be formed in Ignatian spirituality, and
Yes,
they inspired you to dedicate yourself to it. So I wonder if you see that, you have a few examples of those who have been lifelong formed in Ignatian spirituality, and are there enough of them to be able to kind of have that impetus for people to say, I want to be like what I'm seeing in that person?
such a great point. It's really really good. And the issue is we have to have men and women formed at depth, whether they're Jesuits or whether they're lay folks, formed
Mhm.
at depth who took that time, who had a lot of time to seep and to steep, I should say, and really soak it in. It's at a level below just sort of the buzzwords, so that they can be attractive and they can be hosts in that way to bring others in. Because whatever space we carve, it's going to be relatively small. But I think we
Mhm.
can do 4 day silent retreats. I have something here at SLU called Well Springs where I carve out 4 days, 5 days, four
Mhm.
nights, and it's a silent retreat. And it is with a director. You're praying from scripture. You're actually going to taste the exercise. I'm not going to talk about them. You're going to go pray this way. And it's so hard to get folks to carve those days out during the school year and
Mhm.
say, I'm going to do this. But they're never disappointed. The testimonials are, sort of off the charts. But how do you get adults to step in? I think you've named one of the ways by having men and women really deeply formed who are attractive and who say, "Well, I'd like to have whatever experience he or she has had." Yeah,
You talked a lot about different experiences, Jim. So I know maybe this question is going to seem obvious and seem like there's probably multiple ways you could answer it. But if you had to pick a pivotal moment for yourself where you felt like there was that, a single moment for you that was pivotal in your own formation that may
yeah.
have led you to commit yourself to more time, like you were just talking about, because I think that's the key to get people to carve out that time. Is there has to be something that hooks them in and they see the value and like, okay, this is it. I'm feeling the growth. I feel the presence of God in my life. This is what's going to allow me to commit myself more time to this growth. Was there something like that for you?
Yeah, well, thankfully, there were a number of those kinds of things starting when I was young and continuing. When I was in college, and again, they didn't tell me I was going on an 8 day silent Ignatian retreat. They just said I was. They just
Sneak it
said I was
in.
going. You know, and a
Yeah.
Jesuit led it. And here he was praying through the scriptures and challenging me to accompany Jesus, and my head was spinning. I mean, I had never
Mhm.
been through anything this psychologically and emotionally intense, which was both my life and the life of Jesus. I remember thinking and feeling, what is this guy doing to me that is stirring me up to this degree? And then I'm spending all this time in silence with this stuff. So that certainly, when I was in my early 20s, was one of those experiences for sure.
It sounds like you're suggesting we kidnap our staff and employees, don't tell them where they're going or what's going to happen, drop them off somewhere and leave them there for 8 days.
Well, some version of that,
With a director.
Yeah. I'm not
Yeah,
sure if legally if I can get the board to buy into that one, but I'll bring it up and see what they say.
yeah. We package it however we can, right? Sell it however we can. Yeah.
I appreciate the sneakiness though, because I
Yeah.
think that's one of the, Jesuits meet people where they are. Ignatian spirituality says start where a person is first and then, have those conversations. And so it seemed like they met you where you were. and then they snuck you away and said, okay, now you're going to go a little bit further into this. But you
Yeah.
wouldn't have gone if you didn't trust and believe in the people that were inviting you, right? If you
No,
didn't
no,
see
that's right.
something that said, I want to go.
I remember standing at the back of a classroom with John Kavanaugh, that Jesuit that I was speaking about, who came out to this retreat. And I remember that conversation as if it was yesterday. Here was a man meeting me at a crucial moment in my life. I was discerning whether I was going to continue studying for the priesthood. And he really met me in that moment. It was very honest.
Mhm.
And yeah, what he represented and what the Jesuits that met and influenced me represented was something that was attractive. I didn't end up going to the society. I thought about it for a while, but I never left their orbit for those many years.
Yeah. So, particularly, obviously you're drawn to Jesuit education, but I want to know why you're drawn to Ignatian spirituality in particular, because you're a coach, you're a teacher, but you moved into this formation. So, what about not just the people that you saw that were formed in the exercises, but what about the exercises, Ignatian spirituality? What draws you into that?
Well, like I was saying at the beginning of our conversation, I'll kind of answer this in two parts. I was getting Ignatian spirituality before I got the name for it. When I had my first year of teaching at St. Louis U High, I really had been introduced explicitly to Ignatius very little, but I had been introduced to Ignatius at a very intimate level for real, at an authentic level. So I started teaching and I said, what do I want to say to my students? And I found myself putting at the core of my course, uh, being in search of your deepest and best desires, because what you most deeply want and desire, if you can discern that, is actually what God wants for you. And that's really core to what's going on in the exercises in Ignatian spirituality, which I had not read or studied. And
Mhm.
the other center of my course was the incarnation. I came up with this phrase called the incarnational perspective, which was a way of seeing all of your experience through the lens of the incarnation. Again, that's super Jesuit, super Ignatian,
Mhm.
but I hadn't been taught that in an explicit way. Instead, it had been given to me sort of directly. And what that meant was that things like biology, I'm a field biologist by amateur practice, and I was given permission by Ignatian spirituality to delve into things like nature study, to
Mhm.
really kind of revel in it for what it would reveal to me as a human being and what God had to say to me in the midst of experience. Finding God in all things is a wonderful aphorism. But what I find is often is that people don't want to delve into the all things to find the God that wants to speak to them there. They skip over, really enter into whatever it is, the all things. And for me, that was nature study. So one of the things that really drew me to Ignatian spirituality was this permission to cross over into literature, into nature, into
Mhm.
science, uh, and to find in that journey something that God was stirring within me that would be really fruitful and lead you places in prayer, sometimes places that are quite difficult and kind of adventuresome, but nevertheless real. Geography is an interest of mine. People and culture, deep interest of mine. And so when you meet people in a different culture, as I've been lucky to do in some travels, you're really meeting another face of Christ. And so to have a theology which makes you aware and awake to what God might be doing when you've crossed out of the explicit realm of faith, church, and prayer, that is a thing about Ignatian spirituality that's been galvanizing for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's great to be speaking to someone who has met, 4 decades of students, because I wonder how that fits between the first students that you encountered and then the students in 2024. Like, is there a difference in how you have to introduce even your colleagues, how you have to introduce Ignatian spirituality to them, how they connect with it? Because everyone says the world is so different, though some things are still the same. So, how does that path been?
Oh, that's a great question as well. There's so many things there I'd like to speak to. I'll simplify one of my answers this way. When I started as a teacher, it was relatively easy to say, "Hey guys, let's talk about your experience." And they wanted to talk about their experience. What they didn't particularly want to talk much about was faith, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and it's kind of flipped today. We've found our way back as a church to sort of enshrining devotional faith. And our students, at least at St. Louis U High, they know that devotional faith and a deep respect for the church, kind of on its terms, in its ancient language and forms and rituals, that's a part of the way we roll at St. Louis U High. It's a little bit more of a challenge today to get them to enter into their experience, if that makes sense. The other thing that's a huge challenge, of course, today is what they're dealing with through their machines, through their phones and through their technology. And to find a way as a Jesuit school to say, we're not frightened of that. We want to embrace it as a tool. It can be an avenue. It can be one of those all things through which we seek God. But you do have to become aware of the special challenges and temptations and difficulties that go with that, because it really can, in some fundamental ways, cut you off from experiences that are God-laden. Silence, for example. It's very difficult to really enter into silence with a phone in your pocket. And so one of the cool things has been St. Louis U High is getting better and better each year, whether it's the ethos of a retreat or even the rules at school of saying technology is great and it's an avenue and it's a vehicle and it's a tool, but we're going to set it aside at times so that we can be open to one another and to where God is, because that tool will get in our way. So those are just a few things that strike me with your question.
That's such a struggle for us as well, Jim. I'm sure obviously every school is struggling with that in so many ways. And personally, in my role here at Loyola High School in Montreal, I'm also our dean of students in terms of I do mission stuff, but I'm also our dean. And this conversation of what to do with the phone takes up so much time because everybody has a different opinion on it, right? And the idea of the tool itself not being a bad thing, which I totally agree with, but also trying to create an environment where there's an opportunity for conversations and relationships. The phone is a huge obstacle in creating that. So it's a conversation that is often polarizing and probably shouldn't be, because it's a device and not something more than that. But it's one of those things that absolutely has cut students off in some ways. Forget just relationships with God. It's even relationships with people in their own life. It prevents them from connection in ways that we didn't have to experience for a long time in Jesuit schools. And I think remains something that our institutions need to find a solution for. And I say solution in terms of like, how do we approach this without saying it's bad, it's bad, it's bad.
Yeah. And what's exciting about your question is this, and I'm very enthused about this. We in Jesuit education have a tremendous advantage in this conversation because we can tell a story of Ignatius who opens up his comic books and feels a certain way. And then when he opens up the Gospels, he feels a certain way. And he begins to realize that the fruits of the one are really deep and the fruits of the other shallow and superficial and not fulfilling. We can lead our students, and I can tell you, the students are ready to go there. They're ready to talk about what it feels like to be too tied into the phone. And if we help them, they're ready to talk about what it feels like to be occasionally free of it and in touch with our experience and one another and God in this other way. We've got a vocabulary. We've got a history. We've got tools. We've got a theology. We've got a practice. Those are advantages that we've got.
Well, I also wonder, because we often have the conversation about phones and technology and students. And, as I'm going to be the one editing this podcast, I can say I am a culprit of like being attached to my phone and my technology and all of that. So really, even as faculty and staff and administration, like modeling that for our students, I mean, I find a lot of difficulty in that myself. I have to be connected to my phone because I have children, or I have, and then, someone gently reminds me that in the 80s and 90s, parents still got their children everywhere they needed to be without being connected to their phones. So yeah, there's definitely work to be done on both levels, right?
That's right. And we have this marvelous Saint Ignatius who, in the pages of his autobiography, they didn't have phones, but he talked about his attachments and he talked about how hard they were to let go of. And he was even in despair at times of whether he'd be able to let go, but he did. And he taught a method of recognizing those attachments and getting to freedom. I was sort of shocked when I read Ignatius's autobiography for the first time and read about a guy with scruples who couldn't let go of confessing his sins, and how in the end he learns from his own unhealthy attachments how to be free. we've got it. We've got that story. That's in the hopper.
Yeah. Jim, we have a couple questions that, because JP and I can't decide which one of our questions is better, we're going to ask both of them. But before we ask them, I know you have a podcast yourself with the faculty and staff at St. Louis U High. Do you want to talk briefly about that so people can listen to it if they would like?
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thanks very much. Yes, Insignis, the SLUH podcast, is a high production project, so I don't get them out very often because they take so much time to write and sort of edit. But they're sort of an attempt to do this God in all things thing that I've been talking about. So I might be talking to an improv teacher. He was my first guest, and we get to some really fun, interesting territory about this interface between the things and the spirit. The last one that I did was about a guy who's the CEO of Eddie Bauer, who was a student of mine and had some encounters in the wilderness, and it transformed who he was. But he feels like his contact with the Jesuits and things Ignatian really set him on that path. So in short, it's long conversations with music and student voices and trips down the hall to listen to students that come around certain themes. Could be global education, could be tech, could be, you name it. And the idea is to sort of see if crossing back and forth between the thing and the spirituality is fruitful. So really have had fun with it. I loved radio my whole life and never thought that I'd get a chance to give it a try. So it's been really a blast.
Well, and I know you love music too, so I'm sure you do a great job incorporating that in to the podcast. Where can people find it?
So they can find it on Spotify, they can find it on Apple iTunes, and they can find it on the St. Louis U High website, www.sluh.org. Search for Insignis, the SLUH podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for advertising that. I look forward to checking out some of those episodes. So one of the last two questions that we're asking all our guests is, it was actually part of an essay that I gave students last year in a Jesuit history class. But if you could travel back in time to 1540 and ask Ignatius one question, what would it be?
Oh, that's really cool. And I have many that I'd ask now because I got the good fortune this summer for the first time to get over there and to go on the Ignatian pilgrimage that our province organized and be able to walk in his footsteps. And it was much more moving than I thought it would be. So I have too many questions in my head, but what I might do, I think, is ask Ignatius the student, who was deep in his formation, not his early conversion, but deep in his formative years, where he was really suffering and trying to not only be a student, but curb his appetites, become a freer person, hear God more clearly through the din of his own psyche and emotion. I'd just like to talk with him about how because he had so much courage. He had so much fortitude and so much desire for God. I would just love to hear him talk a little bit about steps along the way in that journey. You can see where he got to in his late life, but what we miss, I think, because he doesn't talk a lot about it in written material, is those many years of sort of earning his freedom and his openness to God, one hard choice at a time. I'd love to just plunge into his life. For example, he was at the Church of St. Maria del Mar. He was nothing but a beggar and a student, but clearly on the way. And it would be really wonderful to say, so where are you today, Ignatius? What is God telling you today? And how are you meeting today's challenge as you humbly make your way from one station of life to another?
What a great story that would be. Yeah.
I love that answer. It's funny. I remember speaking to my own spiritual director a couple of years ago about when doing the exercises, that conversation of those years missing in the Gospels of Jesus's life too, right? Thinking about what was it like for him, not in these moments when he was doing his ministry, but everything up to that. And there's just not a lot of that in the Gospels, but hearing about what was his own thought process in terms of what was going on in his mind in those teenage years. What was he thinking? What was he experiencing that probably led to so many important moments that we just don't know enough about at this time? That's such an intriguing conversation to have.
That's right. And we're seeing it through a mirror when we hear his words in Scripture, or we see him function with human beings through the Gospels. We're really seeing all of that. It's just we can't get there in terms of the actual text. We get more of that with Ignatius. But I
Yeah.
find it fascinating nevertheless. And what I find myself saying to people is, you in your life now, you're in one of those moments. They likely won't be written down, but you're in one of those moments when God is active. You're in one of those moments when there's a richness here that you're following out. It's so worthwhile. Know that Jesus and Ignatius in their ordinary lives earned that one day at a time, just the same way that you are.
Yeah.
The last question we have for you, Jim, before we let you go, I know you're probably very busy. Was there a moment for you that you felt the call to Jesuit education? Not necessarily your formation, but there was such a strong call to Jesuit education that you could no longer deny that that was your vocation.
Yeah, I think when I left the seminary, I could name many moments where the call was you know, enlivened and where I recommitted to it. That happened a number of times. But when I left the seminary, I almost immediately knew that I wanted to teach. And I almost immediately knew that I wanted to teach in a certain way, which I think was very much in a Jesuit or Ignatian way. I may not have had the language for it the way that I think today's adults or even today's high school students would be formed to have the vocabulary. But I think when I turned toward education, which I was a junior in college, I left the seminary and I went into a theology and English degree knowing that I wanted to teach high school. I think I wanted to teach in a certain way. I think I wanted to teach in a way that was Ignatian, that was both devotional and reflective, that was deeply rooted in experience, but continue to refer back to the church's liturgical year and seasons and prayer. So I think that was a moment for me of just realizing I really haven't changed who I am. I really haven't changed what I want to do. It may affect my station in life, but I was clear, I think, even at that point, that an Ignatian approach to education was what I wanted, and I'm quite grateful for that because it really points to the men and women that were there for me along the way. Otherwise, I wouldn't have. I don't think I would have taken that turn.
Yeah. Well, we're really grateful for you, not only your experience, but also your passion for the mission, for Ignatian spirituality, for your devotion the last 4+ decades to Jesuit education. And really glad that you're willing to come on this podcast, but also do your own podcast to be able to inspire other people in the way that you were inspired as well. So thank you so much for being with us today. We are really glad that you are a part of this podcast.
Oh, very grateful to you guys, and very grateful to this network. Isn't it magnificent to have colleagues all over the
Yes.
country?
It is.
And that you're making your way through your career on occasion with other people who are on the other side of the country, and they really feel like friends and they feel like colleagues. So thanks to you guys for your great work and leadership.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you
Thanks so
so
much.
much, Jim.
Thank you.
JP, what'd you think about our conversation with Jim? I know you just met him. What'd you think?
So obviously the first thing that stuck out to me when we spoke to Jim was obviously hearing about the impact of the Jesuits in his life, even when he didn't realize that they were impacting his life. I think that was the most interesting part, is even he himself is able to look back on his life years later and reflect upon the impact of Ignatius, but also the Jesuits in ways that he never quite saw at a young age, that they were present in many ways. And then he's able to reflect in a very, Ignatian way. And looking back, he would probably say that the Jesuits had a huge impact from a very early age. And hearing some of that vocabulary and the language of the Jesuits that they've used for years, he only really started to understand it as he spent more time working in Ignatian education in Jesuit schools. I think that's really interesting to see where sometimes God calls us just outright, and you see it and you hear it. But then there are other times looking back, you go, oh, maybe I was being called or being spoken to at times that I didn't even realize. Those are those most beautiful moments when you're able to kind of go back and see and reflect upon your past life and where God was calling you, even when you didn't realize it. I think Jim does that so well. And obviously he's been around long enough to know to be able to look for those moments that
Yeah.
weren't obvious when they happened. But yeah, that
Yeah.
was beautiful. Just such a beautiful story to hear Jim talk about his life and how he's had such a great impact on students in Jesuit education for so long.
Yeah, he reminded me of the way that Jesuits in my own life have been sneaky about getting you in the door on certain experiences. You're like, oh, we're going to go have fun and hang out. And then suddenly you're talking about God and
Yeah.
your relationship with God. And so reminds us that there's a lot of ways to invite people in that meets them where they are. The other thing that stuck out to me was his wonderful thoughts on finding God in all things.
Mm.
I mean, clearly from his bio that we read at the beginning, he has found God in all different areas of life. It's like a Renaissance man. He knows a little bit about, yeah, everything, and he brings God into all of those things, both for the students and for the faculty and staff. So that really stuck out to me, really capitalizing on what is finding God in all things and what does that all things part really mean.
Yeah, and Jim didn't say this outright. I didn't get that sense, but you could really feel a little bit of that concept of people who work in Jesuit schools or in any religious schools that you don't always get to see the harvest, but the idea of being those who sow the seeds. And I think that was really nice. Even in his own life, you see that the Jesuits were not always immediately looking for the result of what was happening, but that they were watering those seeds and waiting for the fruits to bear to come from that situation. And he's a perfect example of that. And I would imagine that in his work in education, he's probably seen that as well, that he's working with students that may not have in that moment been bearing the fruit the Jesuit schools try to get from their students, but he was able to say, yep, if you wait and you're patient, the time will come and there will be that impact on them. I think the story he told about his track team member who had the painting and
Oh,
talked
yeah.
about that moment that he remembered years later of Jim coaching him and how that was such a formative aspect of his life. That's the perfect example, I think, of what
Mhm.
Jesuit schools try to do is you give them all the skills, you give them the messaging, and you try to have an impact in their life, but you probably don't know the impact that you've had until 10, 15, 20 years later. That to me was a really inspiring part of the conversation.
I also like how Jim models kind of what we all should do when we are getting to, I don't know, I've been in Jesuit education for 18 years, getting towards 20. What should you do when you get to 20 and 30 years? Well, you start mentoring the next generation of people, right? And really introducing them to all of the things that you have been taught. And he does that so well. I know that he has been a frequent member at our new Ignatian Educators retreat in the Central and Southern Province, sharing his wisdom with the new teachers in all of our Jesuit schools, and inviting them into that magic that he felt when he became a part of Jesuit life.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that Jim has a lot to offer, even in a half-hour conversation. I don't think you get the full impact of what Jim could probably
Yeah.
offer, but if you do one of those retreats that he mentioned for a couple of days, you might get a little bit more of what Jim can share with so many people and around the world, right? Obviously, in the States, it sounds like he has an impact, but we'd be
Mhm.
we will hope that we could hear more of Jim here in Canada as well. I think he has so much to talk to us about and he just has a positive outlook. Like 40 years later, I think that's another great
Yeah,
aspect of the conversation
exactly.
is 41 years later, Jim is still incredibly positive about his vocation. That's a hard thing for us to do at times
Mhm.
because it is draining in the work that you do
Yeah.
sometimes. But I never got the impression that he was feeling pressure or anxiety about what's to come or what is happening currently. He just does what he feels he's called to do and is hopeful and has faith that
Mhm.
something's going to come from that situation.
Yeah, and he's always really balanced to he spends time with his family. He includes his wife Mary in his journey, and so he really is a model for how to do the both and
Yeah.
experience. However, like we advertised his podcast, and I'm afraid that all our listeners will go listen to that beautiful work of art and then come back and be like, what are JP and Gretchen doing? Like, do they have any like
Yeah. Most
scripts that they
most
go from?
importantly, yeah, most importantly, you mentioned our listeners as if we know that we have a lot of them, so that
Oh, yeah, all 10 of them.
we're good.
We're
We're
going
good.
strong.
The 10 people that listen to our podcast are going to have that huge impact.
Yes. Well, we hope that that number just
Yeah,
quadruples by
we're
the next
working on
time we
it.
record.
We're
Yeah.
working on it for sure.
Especially this conversation is really going to draw them all
Yeah,
in.
I
So,
hope so.
yeah. So I know that we ended our first episode. I think we're going to continue to do that with points of gratitude and graces desired at this moment in time
Mhm.
for each of us. Do you want to go first?
No,
What your points
you
of
go ahead.
gratitude?
You go ahead. Why don't you
Okay.
talk about something where you're feeling that gratitude this week?
Yeah, so I just got back from our senior community days. Once a year, we take the senior class out in the fall for kind of an opportunity for them to get to know each other better, to pray together, but also to establish that brotherhood, that companionship with one another through the rest of their senior year. And there were just so many graces and blessings being with the senior class and engaging in conversation with them and also having moments of joy and fun out there as well with my colleagues. But it really had me thinking about pausing to take in the moments as we're experiencing them. So a few weeks ago, we lost a colleague who had been a great, long lasting member of our Jesuit Dallas community. And he also really loved community days. He went on it as a student. He ran it for a couple decades, and it was one of the highlights of his year. And so as I was going through it, I kept thinking like I really want to take in this moment and be present to this experience because I know that he would have wanted to be there with us as well. And it had me thinking about when I think of grace is desired, it's that grace for presence, but also that grace to see the lasts in each moment. Because even though it may not be the last time I'm experiencing something ever, it's the last time I'm experiencing something in that moment with those people, so figuring out like, oh, there are some lasts in every moment, and how can God help me be present to them?
Mhm.
And going back to our conversation with Jim, finding God in those moments as well, in every aspect of them.
Yeah, the beauty of kind of living in those moments and feeling the presence of those moments is a really hard thing to do. Like, it's
Yes.
so difficult in the moment when there's 1,000 things happening.
Yeah.
In terms of gratitude for me, we're starting to reach the end of September. And as we get to the end of that first month of school, at least for us here, one of the things that came to mind so often this week is how many people it requires in our institutions to make things run. Like you mentioned, a
Yes.
community day. Think of the amount of people that it takes to have something like that go
Mhm.
off without a hitch. And maybe there are things that don't go smoothly every time, but I'm so grateful for how many people work in our schools and just give countless hours of their time
Mhm.
to make something happen. That is for me where I see God in a lot of the work that we do in the moment. As we said,
Mhm.
we never know the result of what those things are going to be at the end of the day. We don't know, but there is some very clear positivity that comes from them when you go, I can't believe all these people put all this work in behind the scenes to make this happen for us. And I'm really
Mhm.
grateful that to work with amazing people. And I think, and I'm not just thinking of teachers and campus ministers, but I think of people in the office staff and maintenance teams.
Mhm.
We had our open house here at the school last week where we had almost 2,000 visitors at the school. And the amount of work that was put in to open up our school to hopefully welcome new people to Jesuit education is immeasurable. I couldn't even tell you how many people were involved in
Mhm.
the work that they did. And each one of those members of our team are doing their part to open up this school, hopefully so that people can find the presence of God in their lives. So we forget all
Mhm.
those little things, but sometimes at least. But I try to remember that in September, especially when there's so many things going on.
Yeah.
And the grace I desire for that is to remember to be that, to be mindful of that all the time, so that when you
Yeah.
see these people, to just thank them
Yeah.
and remind them that they are crucial to our
Mhm.
schools operating in the way that they do. We could not do it with every single person that is here, and every single one of those people matters in our success. And hopefully God can bless us all with the grace to remember that we're fortunate to have these people in our lives.
Yeah, you make me think about not only our colleagues that do a lot of work behind the scenes to make things happen, but also when we disappear for 3 days, like I did, our families that keep everything going right at home and
Yeah.
making sure that everything's running. So it's really being a part of Jesuit education is not just a solitary occupation. Your whole family has to be involved in the process.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Well, I am hoping that when people hear this episode, that they're like, I want to be on that episode and talk our next episode and talk with JP and Gretchen. So if you are an Ignatian educator that wants to talk with us and share your experience, please reach out. The email address will be there, but we want to make sure that we don't know everybody, even though we're very social people. We do not know everybody. So we want to make sure that we, reach out and get to talk to people from all sorts of schools throughout North America.
Yeah, absolutely. Reach out to us, whether it's on social media, on Instagram, or just through the email, whatever it is. Let us know what it is that you're doing. The whole point of this is to have people share what the work is that they're doing in their schools. And we'd love to have people talk to us a little bit about it. And we hope to have some more guests. It'll be hard to find some people that maybe can match Jim's experience, but forget that. We want some people who might have new ideas and the impact they're having in their community. So I'm looking forward to furthering the conversations for sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, JP, we will sign off soon and then see everybody back in our next episode, which, will come as soon as we can make it.
Yeah,
a couple
absolutely.
weeks.
Thank you for joining us today for our conversation. If you like this podcast and would like to hear more or help others find this podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. Follow along and contribute to the conversation, as well as engage with other resources offered. Follow at living_admiorum on Instagram and bookmark the website livingadmiorum.org. This podcast, an associated website, are an offering of the Jesuit Schools Network and are supported by passionate educators throughout North America. Until next time, remember that your work living towards the greater matters. After all, is how others see God alive in you. Take care, everybody.